For my semester 1 extra credit project, I chose the book Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. Samuel Clemens, but I don't know that yet. First, before we begin on my analysis, shout out to my one and only viewer, Eichen. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. What's important about this story first is the setting. St. Petersburg, Missouri. Now, while that's a fictional city, the Hannibal, Missouri, where Clemens grew up, is very real. And it actually serves as the basis for St. Petersburg. Geographically, they're similar. Where Tom goes in the woods to play Indians with his buddies, that's a place in Hannibal where Mark Twain would do the same thing. He'd play Indians with his buddies. There's an island where Tom runs off to and plays pirates while he's a runaway. That was a real island in Hannibal as well. So it's really cool how Mark Twain takes his childhood home, reimagines it a little bit, and creates this story to go with it. Tom's actually supposed to be a combination of who Twain was as a kid and who his friends were and who they wanted to be. They were this mischievous, playful, and, prank-pulling kids. There's a gang of kids that like to play jokes, and that's exactly who Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are. They're reimaginations of Clemens' childhood, which is, I think, very cool. Now that we know that Tom Sawyer is supposed to be a reimagined, little bit braver Twain, it's important to know who Twain was and what status he was at this time. I do think there's definite parallelism between who Tom is and who Twain was, and the people they had around them. Tom is an orphan, and when Twain was younger, he lost his dad, so there's definite connection there in missing a father figure in who they turn out to be. Tom still had his aunt as a mother figure, and Twain still had his own mother, so it's important to recognize that connection. Also, Twain was, because his dad died, and he had 7 brothers and sisters, things were tight around the house. They were definitely not rich by any means. I do think that's a bit how Sawyer was. He wasn't the richest. I think he's probably middle class. It doesn't describe him as poor like Huckleberry Finn, but neither Twain nor Tom experienced extreme wealth as a kid. They were both, just kind of get what you have, make what you have, do what you can type people. Marble is the most valuable thing you can have at this time, so that's important to recognize. The book, as it says on the first page, was written in 1876, but as Twain wrote, it's supposed to have occurred 30 to 40 years before. So critics say it was supposedly taking place around 1856. Now this was pre-Civil War. Slavery was a big thing in the South, especially in Missouri. So that's why there are definite references to it in Tom Sawyer. Although it's not an everyday thing, that is definitely present. There's also the presence of the N-word. Now, at this time, that was, as we know, just a general term for a black person. I mean, derogatory, yes, but it was acceptable. Now, it's obvious that that is not cool in any way. Now that has a little bit of a different meaning, I guess. It references a time when that was acceptable, and it's insulting. So, many people, many librarians, many schools have tried to ban Tom Sawyer or to get it rewritten and all this dramatic stuff. But personally, I think it does show the time period. It shows that, this was a time when everyone could say that. It was an acceptable word, and that's just how it is. So that's definitely a key of the time period. What really piqued my interest about this story was also when it was written. How does a middle-aged man wake up one day and just decide, I miss being 10. Why don't I write about that? That seems very interesting to me. So I did a little bit of digging on the time period in which it was written. So in the 1870s, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and African Americans could vote. Also, Georgia was readmitted to the Union as the last Southern state, and Reconstruction was over. Basically, the country was starting to repair itself and mend some wounds. But there was still racism still alive, and black codes were being, enforced to try and limit the freedoms of African Americans, and racism was still present. It was still a heavy force. So I could see why, if you had grown up believing slavery was okay, and everyone's telling you, biblically, it's all right, I could see why someone would want to look back at their childhood, examine everything everyone's told you, and, put it into a book, get famous. So I could see why you'd want to re-examine everything everyone's told you and, pick and choose what you really think is true. It's also important to know that, later in life, Twain was, pro-Lincoln and go racial equality. He wasn't always like that. He was a Southern sympathizer, and, he frequently used the N-word. He grew up with slavery around him, and, he was critical of abolitionist movements. That's important to know about him. But, there's this big shift. Eventually he was part of the Lincoln administration. Like, how does that shift happen? This is written about by Fulton in The Reconstruction of Mark Twain, How a Confederate Bushwhacker Became the Lincoln of Our Literature. Basically, Fulton is trying to explain, what happened in Twain's life to cause this shift to happen. And, people are always critical that Twain was a Confederate soldier for 2 weeks because, how can someone now be into racial equality when they were on the Confederate side? Like, how does that happen? Fulton describes his experience as being, the defeat of everything Twain had grown up believing. Basically, the Civil War was when his shift started. He started to realize, maybe things aren't as I always thought they were. Maybe I don't really believe it. And that's part of why his little unit disbanded after 2 weeks and they stopped fighting. It's important to realize that Twain wasn't always who he was at the end. He had Southern roots, and I do think him trying to come to terms with that is why he wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He's recognizing, the adventures he had and how great it was, but he's also realizing, there was racism everywhere, and, we all believed this thing was okay, and it wasn't. So I think this is him coming to terms with that. What was very, very clear to me throughout this entire book is that their time period is not now. Things happen in this book that could only happen in this time period. If I tried to do half of what he did to my teacher or some Sunday school teacher, he got whipped or beaten for it, but I would probably get suspended, which I would think is worse. I'd get suspended or expelled. But no, they get physical abuse, and by today's terms, that would be child abuse, and you could go to jail for that. If I tried to run away, I could not just hop on a raft and pretend to be a pirate for a week and cook fish and live in a cave. If I, in theory, ran away, then my parents would have the police looking for me, I hope, and, 48 hours, they're still looking, Amber Alert maybe, posters everywhere, until I came home. They wouldn't just assume me dead after 7 days because they found, my car abandoned. Half of what they do is running around in the middle of the night or, ditching a boat and staying on an island with a cave. Like, I could not do that. Not just because geographically I can't, but just that's not possible these days. We have helicopter parents. I couldn't do that. Too bad. So it's a fun read to have just because it's like a foreign place, even though it's Missouri and I grew up in Missouri. Like, that doesn't... It's just very strange. Well, thank you, Eichen, for watching this. I'm sure you'll be the only other person to see it ever, so thank you for taking the time. I hope that you found something new and interesting about Tom Sawyer. I'm sure you've heard a lot of reviews about it, so hopefully something piqued your interest. I hope you have a nice winter break.